Good morning.
Good morning. How you doing?
Great. Thanks for suggesting this, Paul. This is such a nice, a really nice bonus, I think, for everybody.
Well, again, some of it was just being selfish and not wanting to type a whole lot. I saw a whole bunch of questions that were, although they're short answers, they're long to write.
Yeah.
And since this was recorded, I thought maybe it would just, I don't know, if I was watching a video of a roundtable, I don't think I'd want to then read a bunch of stuff afterwards. I think I don't know if I'd watch it, but I think I would watch more footage of people answering questions. So it's kind of thinking of it from that angle too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, video is king these days, so getting a chance to, well, and all the responses we've gotten so far, good morning.
Good morning.
It's just been absolutely positive. So, but I think with these roundtables and these conversations, we're never going to run out of interesting topics. And even if we were to run out of interesting topics, we're never going to run out of interesting artists who have different things to say about these.
Yeah, and interesting combinations of artists. There's certainly some artists I would love to see in the same roundtable talking about something. It's people who I admire and like, or and we just like to hear what they have to say on certain topics. So I'm sure you're probably getting emails from folks about, hey, how about this? How about that? I want to see so and so. So it's
and we have instructors who say, "Can I do it? I want to do it." I'm like, yes. Okay, well, let me launch into a couple of these questions. Okay, well, let me start with Kelly's then. What is your favorite story in literature, myth, or other?
Okay, well, that's funny because I actually don't have an answer to this one. I don't have a favorite story, but I do have a favorite painting of a story, and that is Bacchus and Ariadne by Titian. It's just a painting that I return to over and over again. It blows me away, the composition, the color, the movement. Yeah, and the story itself is actually not that interesting, but he made a painting that's even better than the original story.
That's a fun answer. Paul, how about for you? What do you have a favorite story, myth, legend?
Well, I made a list of things because I don't have a favorite one. I just have lots of ones that because I'm an avid reader and researcher and writer, but things like Aesop's fables, Grimm's tales, Homer, all the Arthurian legends, Gilgamesh, and then Greek, Roman, African, Membrane, Ethiopian myths, fables. Those are all things that I've read, and I have like all these books. I grew up reading Tolkien, not just The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, but the Silmarillion and The Fall of Gondor, anything I can get my hands on. And then contemporarily are people like Miles Cameron, John Gwynne, Joe Abercrombie. These are, current fantasy writers, of course, Martin, George Martin. So things that are kind of in that genre, I've always been like the fantasy genre. I've always loved growing up as a kid. And then I took a class as an undergraduate at University of Delaware that literally that set me on this course. It's called Myth, Religion, and Art. And University of Delaware has a PhD program in art history. So they have a lot of these really unique type of classes because it's the thesis work that the person is doing. So this one was Myth, Religion, and Art. And what they did, they went through and said, every culture has artwork that tells the same story. They just tell it through different deities. But most religions like Catholicism and Greek and Roman, they all have a god for every season or a deity for different times of the day. You name it, and there's a corresponding saint and deity. So, and you can do this with any kind of religion and any kind of culture because everyone has tried hard to explain the unexplainable through symbolism, iconography, stories, fables, etc. So that's when I got into reading all of that. And I also, minored, took a lot of classes in philosophy. And so all of those things just got me interested in stories, storytelling, mythology, and then how that influenced medieval art, early Christian art, and then of course Renaissance art, because all of those all that type of work tells stories, or they combine mythologies and Christianity. So when I look at my work, it's sort of all of that reading that goes into how I do storytelling. That's sort of the well that I'm pulling from when I'm thinking about how I approach my work.
And I guess my answer is kind of halfway between your two, which is that I don't have a favorite story necessarily, but I do have a favorite storyteller. The author Amy Hempel she writes short stories, and I have a collection of her short stories that was given to me by a friend a bunch of years ago, and I go back to it and reread it every couple of years. I am not an avid reader. I want to be able to say that I am, but I'm not. But that's one that I go back to over and over again. The way that she writes, she writes in the way that I want to make work, and I don't know if I do it, but I always like think about it and try, which is that she never says the thing, but she like paints around it in this way that by the end of the story, whether it's one sentence or 100 pages, you get it, you know what the thing is, but she never just straight out and says it. It's just she has the most beautiful storytelling style. Yeah, Amy Hempel, I love her.
That's such a hard question that we're answering, because we all love probably all types of books. And I mean, the 3 books I find myself like maybe going back to read, like the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. I read that almost every other year, and I highlight as I read with different colors. And over the years, I've done this for about 15 years now. I find myself highlighting different areas. Or with philosophy, when you read it, depending on where you are in your life, there's different things that you take from it, because now you have new experiences to bring that in. And then also the philosophy of Andy Warhol from, I think A to Z and back again. That's one of my favorite reads, just because, I grew up during abstract expressionism. My favorite artists are, come from that time period, with Basquiat and everyone. Then also Heidegger among the sculptors. That's a great one, because there's not a lot of philosophy that deals specifically with sculpture.
Okay, I'll ask my question. Is there a story that's too dangerous to tell? Is there what pushes you to the edge that you haven't yet been able to cross over?
I'll start with this one. Absolutely. I read that question and I was immediately kind of felt hot in my chest, because I do have a story that I desperately want to tell, that I've been thinking about for years. And I think it would be really cathartic for me. And I think it might be helpful for some people who would see it, but it would hurt someone. So I can't do it. And I struggle with that a lot.
Wow.
I think its resolution will come, but I think it's going to be a while before I can make that work, but I will make that work someday.
I don't know if I necessarily have a story that I kind of feel like too dangerous to tell for me. Only because my work doesn't kind of directly address things like that. I mean, I do incorporate, my race and color in my work, in terms of my characters are all people of color, right? And the features are, mimic people of color. I want the work to look like people who look like me. So there's always going to be shades of brown, that are in all the figures that I do. And that's how I tackle, race and race relations and culture, is that way. More of, it's not necessarily subliminal, but just it's there to see, but it's not about that, right? So I think, and this is something I've thought about my entire career, is that's a conscious decision, because, I don't have a dangerous story to approach, but the danger for me as an artist of color is if my work sometimes gets too much about color specifically, then I right away become that the rest of my career. And then it's hard for people then to look at my work for what I'm trying to personally say about my experiences and what I think about things. They always look at it now in this new lens, that there must be this other cultural component to it that I'm making work about. And that's unfortunate. because everyone has something to say about whatever walk of life they come from, but that's not all they are. So I guess mine would be like a broader concern is not wanting to be sometimes pigeonholed for one thing. And that sometimes does impact when I'm including things, how I include them. So it's there for people to see, but sometimes not too upfront with not wanting to then be kind of, unfairly labeled, you make this kind of work now. Because as a woman artist, as a Black artist, as, as an LGBTQ artist, they all want to be known, we all want to be known as artists, not with the tag on it too. So I'm unfortunately, I am conscious of that. It's like, how can I work in all these things about me and a person of color, but that's just part of the overall narrative and not the defining narrative.
For me, I'd say I tend to start with an image and then about halfway through a drawing, figure out what the story is, and then the second half, develop the story. So I don't seek out stories to tell. So I also don't avoid any stories. But advice I've heard is if you want to be a successful artist, never talk about religion, politics, sex, or death, which are kind of the 4 subjects I specialize in. So I think I'm doing it all wrong, and I plan to continue doing it all wrong.
I support that.
Thanks.
I think that's a great answer. I think you should keep doing it wrong.
Well, then Ian, in your case,
Anyway.
is there imagery that you feel like, is there an image that feels you have to fight your way to get there?
Yeah, a lot of those. One of the things that I started out trying to paint was things that you're not supposed to be able to get away with, such as something that's too gross or too cute. So, cuteness is just completely off limits in fine art. So I started trying to mix those things in, have some kind of cute and sweet images alongside something that's grotesque. And sometimes I would do one that's just grotesque or just cute and sweet. But what I found was that instantly I got a really big audience for the cute and sweet things. And people wanted me to do more and more and more of those to the point where I was like, okay, you just can't touch cute and sweet. I just, can't do it anymore because that's not what I want to specialize in. But like, there are a lot of people who would love me to just do that. So yeah, I find that kind of difficult terrain to work around. Yeah.
People always want to do what they're told not to do, right?
Yeah, that's me for sure.
Makes me curious.
We have 3 more questions, and we have about 20-ish minutes, I would say, to answer them. So let me jump into a question. Laura Green had a question. She directed towards you, Abigail, because you mentioned dementia in your work, but I wanted to open it up to each of you to say, like, what degree of the idea of memories, or specifically dementia or memory loss, does that influence the stories that you tell?
Well, yeah, so the one series that I was referencing, the series is called On the Edge of Lost, and the stories are all from either direct observation or stories I've collected from family members or conversations I had. I had several elderly family members who in the last few years were kind of struggling with dementia and then eventually lost their lives. And so watching the ways in which they changed as they underwent that process sort of became more childlike in this way that was really like sad, but also kind of beautiful, watching them have like it was like a renewed sense of wonder about the world, but at the same time, the confusion and fear. And it was that space where all that stuff overlapped that was just so fascinating to me. But I think what I want people to get from that body of work more than anything is just a sense of tenuousness. And like some of the pieces in that series literally are temporary and will kind of decay and fall apart over time. But a lot of them are just about that idea. I think I said this in the earlier conversation we had, but that idea of like, you know, if you wake up in the morning and you look in the mirror and you don't know who you are, then how do you like reconstruct that sense of yourself? I remember my grandmother looking at a photograph and saying, "Is this me?" And I just thought, like, who are you if you don't know who you are anymore? Because you're still you, right? But if you're just a collection of your experiences, once your experiences fall away, I don't know. I think honestly that series of work is more questions than answers. I don't think it has any answers, but a lot of it is about that parallel I see with childhood. And a lot of it is about our senses and about communication and trouble with communicating.
Kind of like Ian mentioned, you know, I don't typically start out with like a story in particular for a piece. There's just all this stuff going on in my head and I'm working, then all of a sudden I kind of discover what I'm talking about. But a sense of loss is in some things. When I was young in high school, my father had Parkinson's disease and he died from that. So, you know, and then my mother died a few years after that. So, you know, I lost both my parents just a few years out of high school. And I, you know, watched my father deteriorate with that, you know, going from a very strong individual where Parkinson's, the mind is still there, but physically you lose control, you know, of your muscles and your ability to control them. So, of course, that sticks with you, right? And then it also changes what you think about loss. You know, recently, a very close niece of ours, you know, what got killed a couple of years ago. So loss is around everyone, and it kind of goes back to one of the answers about storytelling that we talked about previously, is that, you know, we take all of our personal experiences, and then for me, it works through sometimes metaphorically, symbolically, or with iconography through my work. So while I don't make work about loss in particular, work that does need to reference loss in some form or fashion, that's when I lean on those kinds of my personal experiences with loss as a way to have some specificity for me to include things into the work, while not being about those experiences of loss, exactly about those experiences. I draw on those experiences when trying to manifest that somehow in a work.
Interesting. Yeah, I think too, this idea of like memory and forgetting and identity and the way, I mean, what we know of the science of memory now is sort of that, like every time you remember something, you're like redrawing it.
You're remembering the memory.
Right,
Yeah.
you're remembering the memory of the thing. And so I think I too am really fascinated by this idea of like remembering, but like redrawing memories, but each time you have fewer and fewer like pencils in your box, you know, fewer and fewer I don't know, tools to work with, and the edges start to fray, but you're still working on that image. So I don't know. I don't know if that clarifies anything, but that's, I don't know. It's a thing I think about a lot. And in my own life too, I don't have this problem yet, fingers crossed, but I do think about, like, you know, we've all had that experience where we tell a story from childhood and then somebody in your family goes, "That's not how that happened," you know?
Well, as you get older, like I'm, you know, starting to get a little older, I'll tell a story from just a few years ago. My wife would say, "No, that's not how that happened." Let alone trying to pull something back from 30 years ago.
Right.
All right. Arthur McVicker asks, does your story sometimes change as the materials take control of the work? That, you know, it's maybe something, and, you know, Ian, you kind of addressed this originally because you're kind of more, the story evolves as the image evolves. And Paul, you said that happens for you as well. But, you know, I guess, do you guys have any sense of story or a time when you thought you were setting out to do one thing, but then as you were making it, the materials themselves reshaped what that story ended up being?
I'll go first. Yeah, that happens to me all the time. Probably the best example, it wasn't really a narrative piece, it was a landscape. but I had an idea of a certain feeling I wanted to capture from this landscape from a photo I'd taken. And I started it, and it came out really different from what I had originally planned, but kind of like just an hour or two in, like, oh, it's done. It looks great. This is nothing like what I was planning, but okay, great. So I set that aside and decided to do it again. And this time went for what I was going for. And it came out completely different again, but it was also good. So I set that, I said, okay, I'll do it. So I ended up doing about 5 versions of that same painting. They were all really different from each other. I think some were oil, some were acrylic. And I've had that a lot more recently because I've been focusing more on just really teaching myself to paint with oils and trying out different techniques of mediums and just other like visual ideas that I have. And so often I'll paint something that's like, oh, you know, I kind of like an aspect of this. How can I take this from a study and make it into a finished painting? So then I just set it aside and just look at it for a while. In fact, still in my studio, there's some that I look at, you know, once a week. They've been sitting there for a couple of years, no idea yet, but it'll get there. And then eventually something comes to me and I'll do it, and you just never know where it's going to go. Something I've painted might give an idea for a story, like, oh yeah, isn't there a story about that? So I do some research. Oh yeah, I can make this figure into this person. Like there was a woman I painted, just some Hollywood starlet holding fruit. I just painted her as kind of a color study, and then eventually I thought, well, who holds fruit? Oh, that would be a goddess of the harvest, Demeter. Okay, so then it ended up becoming a painting about Demeter. I called it Hope Demeter because her first name was Hope. But yeah, you never know.
When I read this question, I have to admit that I immediately thought of you, Ian, because it sounds so much like some of the experiences that you described earlier as well. For me, it doesn't. The materials don't take control. I find sometimes that I'm not able to have the conversation with the materials that I wanted to, that they're not working the way that I had expected. And for me, that just means back to the drawing board. I do take what I learned from that, of course, and remember it. And then later I have found, you know, months or years later, making another piece that I thought, oh yeah, what I learned about that red color of enamel is going to be super useful for me in this piece. But the pieces never change until sometimes I'll get all the way done and it's just a flop, and then we'll use that knowledge to redesign it. But I don't have that kind of playful experience that you do, Ian.
Yeah, with all of my materials that I tend to use, you know, I have no control over them. You know, I mean, clay, anyone who thinks they have control over clay is fooling themselves. So everything's an adventure with a lot of them, like with clay, stone carving, wood carving, because you'll start with something and then the grain will be different, or you'll find a flaw in the stone. And, you know, with those types of materials, you kind of change directions. To start over again typically means just to get rid of that material. And so yeah, but that's what I like about it too. I start out with kind of, think of it as an outline, let's say. I kind of have, generally, I know what direction I want to go in. And then as I'm working, and depending on what's going on with the materials, you know, that dictates lots of times how it finishes. And like Ian mentioned too, I have pieces that sit around the studio sometimes for a couple of years.
Oh, yeah.
I'll get to a point and I just not sure where I want to go. Like I got to a certain point that I knew what I wanted to do, and then I'll put it aside. And then I'll come back to it later when I know that piece a little, because sometimes you do need to spend some time with things that you have, especially with figurative work. Sometimes you know the gesture or the posture or the scene that you might want to create as far as compositionally, but you don't know who they are yet, or they change as you start to do it. So I do like that element, and sometimes, and since I do work in a lot of materials, you know, I just distract myself. You know, I'll be hand building a piece out of clay, and then all of a sudden I'll start carving something in lino, and then since I'm carving, I was like, oh, let me work on the stone. So, you know, I purposely work in a manner that I'm not on one thing all the time either. You know, I jump around to different projects that I have and pieces going on. So I do like the sense of discovery along the way and ending up with something that I didn't plan. But like Abigail said, when I'm doing reprise, and yeah, that's kind of, you know, you have a particular direction you're going with metal, and you have to kind of, there's a little bit less play with that. So I do like practice stuff. So there are some materials where here's step A, B, C, D, and if one of those steps go wrong, you can't take it in a different direction. It just doesn't lend itself to that. So so I kind of like those mix of things, but I definitely like discovery. And if materials send me in a different direction, then it's an adventure to see what happens, and I welcome that.
So Sandra Miller describes her own work as she describes herself as a storyteller. So she was participating and listening in the conversation. She had used Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass in a piece of hers. And so her question to y'all was, even though you did make it very clear that every story you tell is your own story, when or how is it appropriate to use other narratives in your work, and how do you incorporate that?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think a lot of artists do that really, really differently. I think because my stories are all about the ways that I've interacted with other people, or that other people have interacted with cultures, that there is sort of a necessary collaboration. And for me, I try really hard not to use someone else's work directly, but to use elements that would reference them. So for instance, like my grandfather was a hobbyist woodworker, and if I wanted to make a piece about him, then I would probably use some of those materials and techniques to make that piece. There are people in my family who were avid embroiderers. And so when I want to tell stories about them, then I'm probably going to do it through that medium. And I might reference a photograph of a home that they lived in or something like that. And trying not to use their work necessarily, but to sort of point to it, if that makes sense. Yeah, pointing to it.
I could say that that question is an easy one for me to answer. I think part of the reason that I reference myth instead of literature is I'm looking for commonalities among stories and basic archetypes. So what I take from any story is really not very specific. I'm looking for like a grand theme that plays out in one story after another after another. I don't know, I guess it just makes it a little easier for me to pick a story since I don't feel I'm taking anything specific from any particular story because I'm taking something kind of grand and universal.
Yeah, I guess a bit like both of your answers where, no, I don't reference any stories directly, but it's kind of on the shoulders of them a little bit. You know, I want my work to be read like Renaissance work is read, or I want it to be seen through those lenses because of, you know, the iconography and symbolism, et cetera. I want you to read them a certain way. So stylistically, I certainly reference things there. But as far as like certain stories or narratives or something someone else did, I kind of put all that through the same filter that I would appropriation. It's like, you know, if I'm using something in a manner where the viewer might see that directly, then I've leaned too heavily into that, right? So I kind of use that as a guide. Where if I'm looking at my work and I'm like, that's way too much like maybe the reference that I was maybe looking at, that kind of got me going along that. If I see too close of a similarity, then I might want to make some adjustments. So it's still about what I'm trying to say and not about what my reference was or where my interest came from. And sometimes if it's when I'm dealing with iconography, sometimes I'm leaning pretty hard into that, right? Because I want people to see that first and then use that as a jump off point. But I still want it all to be uniquely mine, where I'm just not like appropriating something directly and popping it in there. So like Abigail mentioned, it's going to be different for each artist depending on what kind of work they make, especially visually, what kind of work do they make. But I think at the end of the day, if you have your own set of filters that you kind of run these decisions through to make sure that you're staying true to your story and not leaning in too heavily in these other things where it's kind of confusing what you're trying to say. I think you'll be okay.
Well said.
Guys, this has been exciting for me to talk more with you and gather us all together again to hear your answers to these questions.
Well, I'm glad we're able to get the whole gang together again.
I know.
We have the same backgrounds. This is
I know. It feels so good.
Oh.
I just want to say that personally, I'm thrilled that, you know, for the couple hours we've got to spend together this week, I'm hoping that people who are watching this get as much enjoyment out of this conversation as I've personally gotten out of it from listening to to you guys talk about your work and your thoughts, because these are things that I'm going to be thinking about, you know, things that both of you have said. I'm going to be thinking about them now as I'm working in the studio. So I'm thankful to be part of this, and I'm glad that you guys were able to, you know, I haven't met you two before this, and now I have two new friends.
Oh, I feel the same way. This
right.
has been so much fun and such an honor. I really appreciate the invitation. It was very flattering, and it's been wonderful.
Awesome.
So same time next week?
Same time next week. I'll see you next Wednesday.
The relationship that you have with three-dimensional work is that, you know, when the relationship you have with a person is different, you react to each other. The relationship you have with a chair, there's no reaction there because it's an inanimate object. Now, sculpture is inanimate, but it still has a presence where you interact with it like you interact with a person. So he talks about the relationship that you can have physically with a sculpture in terms of how you react to it. That's important. So anyway, so it's, so I think philosophy.
Oh no.
No. I'll edit this, y'all.
What if that happened to us in real life? You're just talking to someone, all of a sudden you freeze.
Well, Ian, I hope you know everything is cake, so that could happen to any of us at any point. So
Oh wow.
I don't know. Do you get that? I was making a meme joke. I don't know if you got that, but
I didn't get it.
there was I guess BuzzFeed has like a food column, and they did a video of the title of the video was like "Everything is Cake," and it was all these real life objects, but then you have a knife and cut through it. It turns out it was a cake. It looks like a Nike shoe. It looks like a telephone. It looks like a tissue box. It looks like a pizza. And so then there's all these memes, and it was like, is everybody, am I cake? Is everybody cake?
This is my boyfriend's job every evening, explaining the internet to me. So thank you.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know why
Like, I found it funny. What does it mean?
Well, Paul, you turned into a sculpture that we were trying to react to. But
Well, hopefully I made my point before it got disconnected there temporarily.
Yeah, I think so.
And as I was saying, Deborah, I'll edit this down a little bit so that it's more the question and your answers. But
Yeah, you can edit out my last philosophy rant.
I'll edit to the appropriate point.